Go ahead.
Okay, this is a totally unplanned presentation. It's not anything I wrote out. It was prepared in the last 20 minutes, roughly. So we'll see how it goes. It's just there are a lot of things. These have been terrific sessions, and there are a lot of things in the sessions to be stimulated by, but there are also a lot of things to be radically discontented with. One of the sources, and I'm going to try turning a few of these things on their head and being a total contrarian, and see if you'll let me out of this room alive when I'm finished. This, by the way, can be turned into a hangman's noose with just a little effort. So, first of all, there is this sense that Western civilization is something evil, and it's becoming more evil all the time. Capitalism is a word that's flung around constantly here without any real examination of what capitalism is or means. The dystopian ideas are being referred to on a regular basis. The idea of the panopticon, that we're all under constant surveillance and that somehow Google and Facebook are destroying us. These are common ideas in all of these sessions. So first, let me take on the question of capitalism. What is the Western system doing for us? Is it successively hobbling us more and more, loading us up with more and more chains until we can barely crawl? Is that what it's been doing for the last 230 years since the early days of the Industrial Revolution? Not on your life. It is precisely, very much, the opposite. Look at a few statistics. If you've been born in 1850, well, let's go back a step. Every system that calls on us, that calls on our idealism, claims that it is going to lift the poor and the oppressed. Well, let's see. Has China done that? Until recently, until the Deng Revolution of 1980, no, China did not do that. People were starving to death in China in such vast numbers when I was a child that my mother was constantly warning me to eat my plate of food because children were starving in China and India. Has Islamic civilization done that? No, from 1951 until approximately 2000, when the United Nations did a survey of Arab countries, the lifestyle had not essentially increased in standard of living at all in the Arab world, and South Korea, which had been at the same level as Egypt in 1951, was now, the average South Korean was making 17 times as much as the average Egyptian. By the way, that's after South Korea westernized. In the West, these phenomenal things have happened. So if you've been born in 1850, no matter where in the world, your life expectancy would have been 38.5 years. If you'd been born in the Western world, specifically in the Western world in 2000, your life expectancy would have been 78.5 years. That's not just a doubling of the human lifespan, that's more than a doubling. The day you were born, you got 2 lifetimes for the price of 1. Do you know how much Chinese emperors were willing to give just to get an extra 2, 3, or 4 years of life? And usually it didn't work. They ended up poisoning themselves with the mercury in the potions that were supposed to keep them alive. So much less 40 years. If you were the poorest paid worker in London in 2000, you earned what an entire tenement full of the poorest paid workers in London had earned back in 1850. In 1850, the poorest paid workers were Irish dock workers. You earned what 7 entire Irish families, well, only the men were working, but there were a lot of kids and wives to support, had earned as a personal assistant, which was the poorest paid job in London in 2000. If you were born in 1650, anywhere in the world, especially in those wonderful indigenous tribes where everybody lives in peace and harmony with nature and in peace and harmony with each other, if you've been born into one of those tribes or been born in the West or the East, your odds of dying a death at the hands of a fellow human being would have been 10 times what they are today in the West. In other words, Western civilization has increased peace by a factor of 10. If we took 100 kids off the street in any American city, British city, or European city, and gave them a Stanford Binet IQ test from the year 1900, do you know what the average dummy The kid that we're told is being dumbed down by Facebook and Twitter and Google, do you know what that average kid would get as an IQ score? 135, just below genius. That's an average kid. In other words, we've added 35 IQ points to the life of the average kid in 115 years. One other little tiny detail, but it's indicative of the general quality of our lives. If you were born in 1850, or if you were born today, you would have been 4 inches taller than you had been in 1900. 4 inches taller. I still am the old height, Francis is the new height. So, does this look like a civilization that is producing an ever-increasing amount of agony and incapacity? Does this look like a dystopia one so wildly out of control that if we let it continue on its current path for another 10 years, woe be unto all of humanity, not to mention all of nature? Not exactly. Then there's the idea that Facebook and Google, because they are gathering vast amounts of data on us, are stripping us of our privacy. Well, first of all, let's remember something about our concept of privacy. Our concept of privacy is a relatively recent artifice. In approximately 11,000 years ago, some crazy guy came up with this wild idea of yanking these huge things out of the ground that were just in everybody's way all of the time, and putting a bunch of them together. Yeah, it was going to take 30 years, but he promised you, if you did what he said and pulled all these boulders together, eventually you'd have something of value, which was obviously ridiculous. The guy was conning him. Well, after 30 years, what did he have? The walls of Jericho. That was the beginning of the first city. 2,000 years later, some even crazier guy came along with another one of these cheap scams. He said, if you take mud and you put it together in a rectangular form and leave it in the sun to dry, he'd produce an incredible miracle for you. Well, first of all, mud. We all know what mud is. Mud can kill you. And if you've ever been in the Middle East during the rainy season, you know that even on a normal day, you get up to here in the mud. And if you're an unlucky person, like the bogmen they find in Ireland, well, it went up to here and you never were seen again. So the idea of making anything useful of mud, ridiculous. Secondly, a thing of mud, this shape, a rectangle, hell, there's never been a rectangle in the history of this cosmos before, with the exception of crystalline structures in certain rocks and metals. On a macroscopic level, never. Rectangles have never existed in this universe. What in the world gives you the impression they ever will or will ever amount to something? Well, by the time the people of this peculiar place in Turkey had actually listened to what this guy said, worked along with him, and made roughly 60 million of these things, they ended up with the world's first apartment complexes. They ended up with buildings with 3-room apartments, identical 3-room apartments, enough for 60,000 people. Enough for 60,000 people. And those apartments led to a bunch of things no one had ever imagined or anticipated. They led to flat surfaces, the core sort of things that the Greeks would, 7,000 years later, turn into geometry. They led to right angles, something no humans had ever seen before. Most important, they led to something we call privacy, or at least relative privacy. For the first time, a nuclear family could live in its own little 3-room apartment. Now, if you've got 2 kids, 4 kids, or 6 kids, that's not much privacy. But that's where privacy came from. And then the introduction of new rooms, and approximately back in the days of Louis XIV, when somebody wanted to, or when Louis XIV wanted to get to his apartments, he had to go through a bunch of other people's bedrooms to get there. Now, if those people happened to be doing something that they would have liked to keep private, sorry, no privacy. That's the way things were set up back then. Further expansion of the idea of what a room was in the last 250 years is what's led to our concept of privacy. So privacy is very relative. Secondly, I was on a panel with Peter Norvig, the head of research and development for Google, a couple of years ago, trying to explain to him what the future is of the web. That's what our ostensible topic was. And I was trying to explain that there's about to be a total turnaround in the model of advertising. Up until now, advertisers have had to saturate us constantly with message after message after message in the hope that hitting 10,000 of us will eventually reach 10 of us. But what I was trying to explain to Peter is he was getting his hands on the kind of information about us that would allow him or his machines to anticipate when we were about to need something before we even knew that we needed it, and instead of blasting 10,000 people with irrelevant and irritating messages, could come to us directly at the right time and save us a hell of a lot of time in thinking out what particular good or service would help us achieve our next goal. Well, if you don't have to think of what good or service you need to achieve your next goal, you can do a lot more thinking about next goals. Which leads, so basically the idea of the panopticon, the idea that these companies are keeping their eyes on us all the time, that need be better for all of us than we think, if it's used in the appropriate way. If it's used to anticipate our needs and bring us together with the person making the thing or doing the thing that we need at precisely the right moment. Then there is the rise of unexpected needs. Whenever there is a technological revolution, we now, until approximately 1815, new technological revolutions came along once every 85 years or so. After 1815, we've had new technological revolutions every 15 years. That's ever since 1815. And now, sometimes we have new technological revolutions every 5 years. And when something like this, or this, comes along, it makes totally unexpected changes in our lives. One example is, once upon a time, there was a philosopher, and he had an extremely good reputation that he was constantly working to build it even higher. And there was a new technology, and new technologies usually are glommed onto by kids. They really love them. And parents hate them because they're sure they're about to dumb down their kids. So a new technology came along, kids loved it, parents hated it, and they knew exactly why they hated it. Plato put their argument very plainly for them. This technology is going to dumb the kids of Greece down so dramatically, it will be a miracle if they have any IQ points left in their brain whatsoever. What was the philosopher, Plato, complaining about? The book. And why was he complaining about the book? Because up until then, there was a clear and obvious exercise that trained Greek minds and made them intelligent. Memorizing the two books of that civilization, the Iliad and the Odyssey. If you stopped forcing kids to memorize those books, their minds were going to turn to mush. What he didn't anticipate was that 100 to 150 years later, there would be an entire library full of books in Alexandria, in Egypt. And scholars would be able to come across the Mediterranean. Admittedly, it was an expensive schlep and time-consuming, and be able to consult, instead of just 2 books in a lifetime, they'd be able to consult 120 books or 2,000 books in a lifetime. So there are vastly unexpected consequences that come from new technological innovations. Tom Watson, you probably know this, I'm not sure his first name was Tom, but it was Watson, the founder of the guy who was running the International Business Machine Company in the 1940s and 1950s. For the government needed these things to calculate these massive military tables, to do incredible amounts of arithmetic to predict where an artillery shot would land, so they'd get it to land in the right place. And companies like Watson's were tasked with inventing this new thing called the computer. And Watson, who was the expert in the world on computers, said unequivocally, there will never be need for more than 5 of these things in the world. That's an expert. Okay, so one of the things that scares me about the vision of us thinking through our future, which I agree with, I want to make history. I mean, that's our job, is to make history while we're here. But when I think of us bright people sitting around and anticipating what paradise is going to be like and how we can get there, it's very important to remember how stupid we are and how many absolutely ridiculous unintended consequences come spilling out of something new. I get furious when somebody talks about exercising ethics and morals in any area of science, because ethics and morals keep us from pursuing our curiosities. And when you stop us from pursuing our curiosities, you stop us from developing new things. And the time in which to stop horrible things from happening is not in the early development phases of a new technology. It's once the technology has been developed, because any technology can be used for criminal ends, for horrible ends, or for wonderful ends. And you won't even know what those criminal and horrible ends are until the new technology exists. So give it a chance to exist. Don't start prejudging. Or the Chinese are going to eat our socks, because those at the moment, all of the things that we've got moral compunctions about, like cloning, genetic engineering, the Chinese are indulging into the nth degree, probably snickering at how foolish we are. I don't know. I'm certainly, well, I'm not snickering, I'm crying about how foolish we are over these things. Let's see, just another little concept that's only come up here a couple of times, a population bomb. So you know that Paul Ehrlich in 1968 wrote a book called The Population Bomb and predicted that by 1980, which seemed a long way off in the future at that point, we'd all be standing on each other's shoulders and starving to death because there wouldn't be any physical room left in the world. He said we would be starving by the hundreds of millions at a time. Well, correct me if I'm wrong, 1980 is behind us, right? And how many hundreds of millions of people starved? None. The amount of food being produced in the world increased. So, but there's another factor. The amount of creativity in the world has also increased. That's one of the reasons we have these technological explosions every 5 years instead of every 15 years. We benefited from the brain power produced by the population bomb. So let's see, how many minutes did I get? Am I coming to the end? Okay, but and on this list, so we have to avoid a dictatorship of the intellectual elite. And every single one of us in this room is a member of the intellectual elite. Let's go back to Plato. Plato said that all states should be ruled by philosophers. If you have any idea of which philosopher he had in mind, I suspect that really wasn't the generic statement. It pretended to be. And each one of us would secretly like to run the world. Are we well equipped to do so? We'd probably, each one of us, make a few good decisions and an awful lot of not so good decisions. So we need a certain amount of humility, and yes, we have to do everything in our power to make things better. Yes, we have to do everything in our power to stop awful things from happening. Absolutely. I mean, even at the risk of our lives, when we see something awful happening, we have to stop it. But we also have to not become so intellectually arrogant that we become a new bureaucratic elite that chokes up the West the way that, that Lenin and Stalin choked off the Soviet Union. So that's it. The speech that wasn't written. You want to take questions?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, okay. So we'll do some questions.
Some questions. There you go.
So first of all, thank you for the very interesting and insightful speech. And I have two questions. Okay, first of all, is you give us some very interesting statistics. And but my question is, yes, the life of the length of our life is getting longer. But are we people only live for the purpose of living longer? I mean, we really feel happiness. I mean, feel happy in this new technology.
The latest research is the latest research is that people are happiest after they retire. I don't know how they're happy after they retire. I couldn't stand it. I couldn't stand it. But this morning there was an interview on NPR this morning, National Public Radio in the United States, which I was listening to over here. And it was with a man who has retired from his job as a bookkeeper, and he's become a lox slicer. He slices smoked salmon. And the man sounded remarkably robust, remarkably coherent. He had everything together, and he was motivated in his life. Do you know how old he was? He was 85 years old. Now, when I was a child, if you were 70 years old, I'm now about to be 72 in a couple of weeks. So if you were my age, or even a little bit younger, you were already senile, you were already doddering. I mean, I did 1,000 push-ups last week one day and 1,050 the next day without stopping. and I'm about to be 72. So your real question is the quality of life. Is it getting better as well as getting longer? Absolutely. Look at all the older people you see who communicating with their grandkids who need them deeply. And it doesn't matter where their grandkids are, because they're with their grandkids wherever they happen to be, on their cell phone or their tablet. The nature, the quality of life is increasing dramatically, both for those who are getting older and for those who still have their parents and grandparents around.
But how about the life before the retirement? I mean, everyone's struggling like to find a job or to have a better life outside the job.
Well, it depends on how you like your work. And it depends on how you've led your life and whether you've been...
We find a job we like and enjoy the job we have.
Well, as I said, I'm almost 72. I'm having the time of my life.
Maybe when we go back to when other people have answered the question, but I'll keep you in mind.
So thank you for the insightful presentation, really, but I'm really puzzled or curious as to how you, what's your position on the following. As capitalism progresses, one striking feature stays all the time through the 230 years and becomes even more so these days. And that is, at the end of the day, the exploitation of the worker for the benefit of the owner, the benefit of the capitalist, if you like. The gap between the two increases dramatically. The inequality increases dramatically. Yes, maybe the quality of life of the worker is better than 200 years ago, but the quality of life, if you like, with the wealth accumulated by the owner is dramatically much better. How do you reconcile this?
Well, first of all, a lot of the stuff that I've just told you comes from a book of mine called The Genius of the Beast, A Radical Revision of Capitalism. And that book, after chronicling all the ways in which things are getting astonishingly better, I mean, better in ways that evolution alone, biological evolution, could never have anticipated and has never achieved. I mean, biological evolution has never given us eyes that can see 11 billion years or 11 billion light years away from us, for example, or that can hear 12,500 miles around the globe. But it isn't capitalism alone that's done this, it's the Western system. And the Western system is composed of three counterbalancing elements. And one of them is government, that builds the roads, or builds the first computers, or builds the first internet. Another is private industry, what we normally call capitalism. And a third, relatively unrecognized, is the protest industry. And the protest industry started roughly 1870, and within its first 24 years had achieved its first absolutely staggering success, a success of a kind that to the best of my knowledge, and I study as much history as I can, to the best of my knowledge, nothing like it had ever been achieved in the history of humanity before. This was not a kingly decree, and yet it outlawed an entire institution, slavery, in 1804 approximately, in England. That was amazing. And the protest industry continued in 1848. There was an unjust war. The United States was waging war against Mexico for no really good reason whatsoever. And there was an American intellectual who holed up in his little shack in the woods and wrote a book called On Civil Disobedience. And that was the beginning of what we know today as peace movements. That was the book that Mahatma Gandhi would later use in India, and then Martin Luther King would inherit from Mahatma Gandhi. In 1899, one of the very first global meetings of the Anti-Imperialism Society was held. And since then, imperialism has basically, as a Western force, has basically died. And we quibble about that, we quibble about Coca-Cola imperialism and stuff like that, but certainly the old style of imperialism doesn't exist anymore. So the protest industry has effectuated major accomplishments, and it has acted as a self-correcting mechanism for the other two elements, and each of the other two elements is operated as a self-correcting mechanism for the protest industry. So it's very important to understand that when we try to boil things down to just one factor that accounts for everything, we are being stupid, because things are recipes. And the recipe for Western civilization is at least a three-part formula.
Okay. You so now go there.
I was also wondering of something, what you would think that I've also observed that many times here in this conference or this panel, there was this idea the system to do something, so we like alter the system, and then it has this output, you know, but we kind of still know that actually we are part of this, so this is on the part of ethics that you were mentioning. We are part of this just complex system, we are part of a complex system that changes over time to complex interactions, and ethics, morality are also part of this system that somehow guide our actions. So we can't really come out of it, because you say, you know, we make too many normative statements, we shouldn't do that, which already is a normative statement. Again, we must let science free because we will gain something from it. So you can.
No, we have to make normative statements. We have to judge, but we have to know when to judge. And the time to judge is before something horrible can happen, when you have time to stop it. We invented the first stone tool. Well, this is just the last week's research. It was thought we invented the first stone tool 2.5 million years ago. Now we know that we invented the first stone tool 3.3 billion years ago. One way or the other, the ethicists should not have been standing around debating whether or not to invent the stone tool. They should have been standing around debating, hey, don't use that to kill another human being. That's the time to make your ethical judgment, and make it in time to stop whatever horrible thing's about to happen.
One question.
Oh, one more question? Oh, okay, Roman. Yes. Over to you. Okay.
We know that privacy is a socially constructed term, and we also know that this historical process, it was historical process. But nowadays, it's one of the most important.
Can you speak up a bit, please?
Yeah, it is one of the most important things for human beings nowadays. So if we agree that this is most important value, we also agree that it's very important to protect it.
Okay, so privacy. Privacy and freedom, which is a subject that was brought up yesterday, and I forget which panel. These are two very important interrelated things. And they're interrelated for the following reason. If you take several rats, if you take 2 rats, and you put them both on the same electrified grid, but you build a cage barrier in between them, and you give one rat a button which you can turn off the electricity, the electrical floor is there to sizzle its feet, to fry it, to torture it, and one has a control button with which you can turn off the juice. The other one doesn't. The rat that has the control button stays relatively healthy, even though he's jolted over and over again with these electric torments. But the rat in the cage next door, remember, they're both on the same floor. When the rat with the button pushes the button and turns off the electricity, both rats cease to experience pain. That means both rats experience the same amount of pain at exactly the same time. And it's turned off at exactly the same time. Turns out that the rat who has the control button stays relatively healthy and stays cognitively healthy, able to perceive things in his environment. But the rat that has no control begins to develop ulcers, his hair begins to fall out, he develops sores in his skin, and in the case of about 20% of rats, he develops what we call learned helplessness. That's most easy to see in experiments with dogs, because put a dog in a shock cage like that, and when you first turn on the jolts of electricity, the dog will scramble and jump and bounce and do everything in its power to escape the pain. But eventually, 1 out of every 5 dogs will simply lay there on the floor, every time the shock comes, will simply sit with full body exposure. The weird thing is this: when you open the cage door and the dog can clearly see a way out, the dog that has learned helplessness will not even attempt to stand up and walk out. That's how important control is. Privacy is a means of having control over your own environment. And one of the reasons, in all probability, that we not only live much longer than we used to, but that we also live a much higher quality of life in old age than we used to, is because the amount of control we have over our own lives is dramatically increasing. And so far, I don't see Facebook or Google. Look, I've been using Google since something like the first month it went into business. Facebook I live on. I do not see either of those services in any way impinging on my freedom. In fact, they give me freedoms, both of them, phenomenal freedoms, that I never had before. And the more freedoms you give me, the more choices you give me, the more control you give me, and the more control you give me, the greater you make, the higher you make the quality of my life. So,
Okay, so I'm gonna go
okay.
to the last question.
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. First of all, I need to make myself clear that I'm not against development. No, I also didn't against technology. But I think technology doesn't come out of vacuum. I mean, there's our power behind how you develop the technology. And also, what happens most of the time is that only that kind of technology that can make profits for the big companies or for the state that can be developed in reality. I mean, maybe we can have some other kind of better technology for the common goods, but because there's no sponsors or no one wants to support that kind of technology, so we cannot develop. So the problem of the the whole system is that we can only develop something that can benefit the capital or can benefit who has the power to make the decision.
That's not actually true. It sounds good. It sounds true, but it isn't actually true. 2 years ago, a company came out with a little tiny motor attached to a propeller. And you built a paper airplane and you put this little motor on the front of the paper airplane and you could fly your paper airplane with a propeller. Also, you could control it with your iPhone. Well, they didn't have money, so they went to Kickstarter. And the idea was so appealing that they raised $1 million and were able to start cranking out their device. That's happened with an increasing number of things over the last few years. But even for people who, even before there was Kickstarter, there was Mark Zuckerberg, starting Facebook in a college dorm room. Now, he wasn't a poor kid, or he couldn't have afforded to go to Harvard, right? But he didn't have a lot of capital behind him. And the same is true of the guys who founded Google. Yes, they were going to good schools, they came from middle-class families, they did not have a lot of what we normally think of as capital behind them. They had Stanford, but that was their school. So it's not necessary. Yes, you have to make a profit. But you know what making a profit and commercialization are really all about? The democracy of the consumer. If nobody wants to buy their goods, you and I have just voted them out of business. If you and I really want to buy what they have to offer, and a whole bunch of other people feel the way we do, they have a chance of making it the way that Steve Jobs and Apple made it, because it's another middle class background situation where there really wasn't any big capital involved in developing that company at all. Does that make sense to you? Because it's obviously doesn't agree. Okay.
Thank you very much.
So thank you very much.